Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, March 5th, 2024. Tonight's topic is what to look for in a therapist. It might be my favorite topic to speak of because one of the things that I love to do, I spend a lot of time training therapists, teaching therapy. But one of the things I like to do is I like to educate the consumer of therapy. I like to educate the client because you don't know when you're in a room with a therapist alone. You don't know what's normal. You don't know if what you're hearing, what your experience is normal because there's nobody watching. It's one of the most important and sacred spaces to be in, and yet there's no reality testing. So I love to provide people with questions, with ideas, with ways to think about therapy so that they can best ensure that they're getting the help that they want and they need. Before I get into tonight's topic, I'm going to pay the bills and do our little commercial for the thing that I believe in as much as anything, Finding You Intensive. Our next available one is March 20th. I believe we have a spot left for that final spot left for the March 20th through 24th intensive. This is hosted in a bed and breakfast in Midway, beautiful Midway, Utah, just on the other side of the mountain from Park City. This is an all-inclusive, immersive experience to look at your past. When we talk about the work, this is what it looks like. I think that it was my best springboard for getting into this work and getting deeper into it. And I entered my first intensive, years after I had my degree, years after I had been in therapy, but it really did accelerate the work that I was doing. We look in your past, we look at your family of origin, we look at whatever's going on with you today, whatever challenges, questions, struggles you might have in a relationship, and we try to help you see the connection between the two. I love what Alice Miller says. It's practically the gospel to me when she says that we have only one enduring weapon in our fight against mental illness, and that is the discovery of the unique emotional history of our childhood. And the research bears that out. We have to understand ourselves in order to clear up the questions that beset us today. And like one of my favorite authors says all the time, James Hollis, says that virtually all the relationships that we have are based on the quality of the relationship we have with ourselves. So Finding You is that offering. If you're interested, contact admissions@evoketherapy.com. Like I said, there's a spot left in our March 20 group, and that's going to be run by our clinical director, Travis Slagle. So it's a wonderful opportunity. So what to look for in a therapist? First, I'm going to qualify what I'm going to say tonight, that when I talk about psychotherapy, I'm talking about attachment-based therapy, the kind of therapy that I do, that I teach about, and that I talk about. I believe that there's a lot of value in various models and approaches, but the way that I think and talk about therapy is this is kind of the foundation underneath all of it. How the therapist is with you, their relationship to you. Even if you're attending a brief therapy, even if you're attending one that's symptom focused, like EMDR, brain spotting, something that looks to remove the symptoms, DBT, which helps you manage your nervous system regulation and protect you from harm. No matter what it is, this idea that the therapist and how they are with you is the healing medicine is underneath all of that. Because if there's judgment, if there's shame, if there's pressure, if there's intimidation, guilt, what have you, if there's any of that, it doesn't matter what the model is. That's what comes through. Like my daughter talks about when she teaches therapy, she explains that what gets communicated more than anything between two people is the energy. And I'm not talking about some mystic idea. I'm talking about the anger, the sadness, the worry, the anxiety, whatever it is, that gets communicated. It leaks out of our unconscious, even if we don't know it. And even if the other person is not conscious of it, their unconscious takes it in. So our unconscious, at the very least, communicates to their unconscious. And that is the message that gets across. So I wanted to give that caveat. Whatever works for you, whatever you like, works for me. This is not a pitch for that my version, my style of therapy is the right therapy. I've even had lots of clients that I've seen over a long period of time who decide that they're going to try other approaches, sometimes for a short period of time and sometimes for a very long period of time. And to me, that's fine. And I ought to have, just like I'm going to be teaching tonight, no ego in that. If what we're doing together isn't giving you the results that you want, then find it somewhere else. It goes back to that idea. And I've heard many therapists try to shame and control clients to say in their therapy with them. If the therapist doesn't present themselves, doesn't relate to you in a different way than your earliest context related to you, I don't imagine that there's any quality of healing that's going on. And I've heard lots of therapists who, like I said, do that. And the client becomes very aware of a couple of things. One, they become aware that this is the therapist's agenda. And if they're not aware of that, then they think even something worse, which is something's wrong with them. Nobody, including me, can tell you what's the right therapist for you and who, but I can give you some tools, some way of thinking, some questions to ask yourself and ask your therapist. First and foremost, I wrote this. I have one piece of advice for therapy students when I'm talking to them, new therapists or even experienced therapists that I'm teaching. And that advice is go to therapy for at least 5 years. I have never met a great therapist who hasn't done a lot of their own work, not one. And because we are, we who get into this field want to help people, we don't want to hurt them, and we're anxious about that time that we're left in the room alone with you. So many people just immerse themselves in certifications, in theoretical constructs that give them the answer, and that becomes at times even more important than the therapist. I love what Carl Jung said when he says, "Master all the theories and techniques, but in the end, just be one human soul contacting another human soul." The therapy I practice and the therapy at Evoke Therapy programs and Evoke Therapy intensives sits on the foundation of the therapist's personal work. It is something our version of therapy suggests and relies on this idea that you can only take clients as far as you've gone. From my therapist and the author Jamie Gill's book, Dr. Gill, a new book that she wrote recently called Doing Psychotherapy, a primer. The therapist is in her own psychotherapy. The therapist that is in her own psychotherapy learns firsthand the complexity of the human development and what can go right and what can go wrong with it. Often therapists learn as much or more doing their own psychotherapy than they learn in school, and I can vouch for that absolutely. And Jamie goes on to explain that in that 1 or 3 or 4 hours a week, if you're doing analysis, in that 1 hour a week, therapy becomes the childhood that you did not have, and the therapist becomes the parent that you did not have. I tell this story about my teenage daughter some years ago. She wanted to go to therapy because everybody in our family has spent a lot of time in therapy. It's just part of our practice, part of our discipline in our family. We don't think it's something that you do when you're in crisis or when you're out of other options. We think it's just like going to the gym. It's a way of life. So she asked to have her own therapist, and she was going to them. She's had a few. She was going to her therapist, and I was driving her on a Saturday, and she said to me on the way there, I think nervous about how it was going to go, she said, "I don't know what to tell my therapist. What should I say to her?" She asked me, and I said, "Of course, I have no idea what you should say to your therapist, but," I said, "if your therapist starts to give you advice, you can tell her you don't need another parent. You already have two of them." And what I was trying to say is a master therapist prides themselves on what they don't say. They pride themselves even on what they don't know. That they don't come to conclusions quickly, that they are constantly evolving their ideas. Listen, it's psychotherapy in this way of teaching, of talking, is a lot more about listening. Listening to understand, not to diagnose or to fix, but to understand. And it is that understanding that heals. Jessica Benjamin, who wrote a wonderful book on attachment theory, is well known as a writer in attachment theory, says that the root of the self is almost always found through another person. That when the therapist or the person finds you, you have that experience of, yes, there I am. And when somebody can't find you, it's really hard to find yourself. That is the primary task in the child's early life experiences. And if it doesn't happen or it happens to a limited extent, we have to go out and find it from other people, like a psychotherapist. As I mentioned earlier, Jamie said, in many ways, a good therapist is the parent you did not have, and the psychotherapy is the childhood you did not have. I love this idea too. She explains that safety, and there's a lot about safety. There's a lot of information about trauma and the nervous system today. I'm grateful for the proliferation of that news, of that information. But sometimes I think again that therapists and clients think that the thing to do is to get right into problem solving. Jamie explains that safety is not the precursor to treatment. Safety is the treatment. I always explain therapy is a place that you go to where you can't get it wrong. You can't get it wrong. You can talk about movies if you want. You can talk about your week. You can talk about your greatest fears, your dreams. You can talk about whatever you want. The therapist is supposed to be the container. And the therapist's agenda or idea is supposed to come secondary in the background. First and foremost, they're to meet you where you're at. I was talking to a friend recently, and as I was explaining my own process, and I said the one reason why I still go to therapy weekly after all of these years is because, like I mentioned earlier, I can't get it wrong. It's the one place that I get to go where I get to be me without filter. I don't have to contain myself. I don't have to edit myself. I can say dumb things, smart things, and everything in between. And I don't owe the therapist anything. I explained, and this is not a slight on therapy, this is its gift. I explained to my friend that once you pay for the therapist's time, because that's what you're paying for, once you pay for the therapist's time, essentially you owe them nothing else. Most importantly, you don't owe them your progress. But again, if a therapist's ego is involved and if they're anxious to be helpful, to be a quote unquote good therapist, and you can somehow sense that from them, feel that from them, it's the same wound that most of us had in childhood. That idea that we have to take care of the authority figure, we have to take care of the adult. But a well trained therapist doesn't need to be good. A well trained therapist definitely doesn't need you to make progress, which, by the way, are the conditions under which the most progress is possible. That's the great paradox. You don't owe your therapist progress. In fact, my experience as a therapist is that clients want to stop coming because they expect me to get tired or frustrated with the same themes and the same discussions. I've had a client say to me, "Are you bored?" I'm sorry, I'm talking about the same things. And my answer is, there's no need to apologize for those things. I'm okay. The implied, of course, message or process is I take care of myself outside of the session, and I'm available to you for this hour, for this session. A well-trained therapist, Jamie explains in the forward to my book, The Audacity to Be You. A well-trained therapist is a person who is skilled at creating an environment that is safe and in which one can feel welcome. That is, the therapist is not like one's parents. The therapist listens. He or she doesn't simply dispense answers. It's really important to understand that distinction. And I'm a parent and a therapist, and in my role of a parent, I fall into my impulses. You could watch me. You could watch me with my family later tonight. You could watch me with my wife. You could watch one of them in distress, small or large, for any number of reasons. And I would not be surprised if you found me doing the very things that I try to teach against, because that's my pull, right? That's my work, to sit and to listen. But in this context, that's my job. My job is not to tell you what the truth is, to tell you the way that it is, to tell you what you should do. In fact, in many ways, I've learned to embrace this idea very much so that I don't know what you should do. But that idea, strange as it might sound to a layperson, that idea creates the condition in psychotherapy where you can do the most important work, which is find your own authentic voice that was lost, that you had to give up because your parents, the culture told you it was unacceptable or wrong. It's really, really critical that the therapist be the container and not be the dispenser of truths. So, are the traits of a therapist? They're flexible. They don't feel rigid. Oftentimes, I have heard therapists talk about boundaries as an excuse or a cover for their rigidity. There was a time I've told this story. It's been a while since I told this story. There was a time when a colleague asked me about boundaries. He was asking me about my own struggle or success with boundaries. And he said, how good are you at boundaries? And I was thinking about the question, taking a moment to think about my answer, and he, I think, interpreted my pause as confusion. So he clarified his question and followed it up with the question. He said, for example, if a client calls you on a Sunday morning, do you make sure that you don't answer the phone to teach them that you don't take phone calls on Sunday? And I stopped right then and I said, I don't set boundaries with my clients to teach them anything. I set boundaries to take care of myself. And it's not the client's job to not call me on Sunday. The client can call me whenever they want. I'm supposed to take care of myself. I'm supposed to be the one in this relationship that is, if you will, I was going to say the adult, but that sounds like a hierarchy. But I'm supposed to be the container, not the contained. Understanding you versus diagnosing you. Years ago, I was doing supervision with several of our therapists, and one of the wonderful therapists, very gifted therapist, was reading through her case notes, all the stories of this particular client. This client had been with us once, was an adult, had been with us once, had some significant success with us, had gone off to somewhere else. I don't know quite where it was, and then had come back for a reset. This individual's parents were not in the picture. There was I think it was a grandparents involved. There was a referring professional from home, so they were involved. And the second time back, this young adult was struggling significantly. The staff were getting frustrated. The students, the peers in the group were getting frustrated. I could sense that the therapist was starting to rise in his anxiety with the process. And I asked this therapist as he was explaining the entire case. I said, "What's your working idea with this individual?" And he said, I think this person has suffered several tremendous, significant attachment fractures, attachment wounds. And I said, yeah, that's what it sounds like to me. And I want to be clear. I said, that doesn't go away real quick. At best, it changes from you having or your attachment wounds and traumas having you to you having them. We're so eager. I wrote this today. We're so eager to get to the end, to arrive. And this mental health journey is something that we are all on. And the people that I admire the most in the field of spirituality and philosophy and psychology, the ones that I admire the most are the ones that know that the journey lasts until you take your last breath. The ones that I worry about the most are the ones who arrive, who have, according to them, figured it out. I wrote a long time ago that I wrote this quote that said that nobody has it figured out. Hardly anybody has it figured out. And those that do have it figured out know that they don't. It's a humility. It's a not knowing. It's continuing to be a student. And so we listen. The diagnoses can be helpful because it's a way of organizing the patterns. That's all it is. It starts off with the defense, the symptom that serves to mask the fear or the threat, serves to distract one from suffering. That's what starts with the symptom. And then each individual has a preference for a kind of symptom. Some like to withdraw, some like to argue and create conflict, some like to self-medicate with drugs, some like to do it with gambling or other process addictions or TV, all kinds of things, right? Some practice self-harm, some ruminate, some dissociate. Everybody has a preference, a style that they're inclined to engage in to deal with the stress of living, of being human. And if that pattern of behavior is consistent enough, we call it a diagnosis. But that's not the way we're really thinking about it. That's just shorthand for understanding the pattern. I had a couple of parents years ago that were divorced, had a very acrimonious divorce. Their respective professional fields and educational fields, they were extraordinarily successful, but couldn't manage the relationship between the two of them. And of course, the young man that was their child felt split and torn the entire time between the two of them. So I took the phone call from the husband first, or excuse me, the ex-husband first, the father. And he described his wife's diagnosis in great detail. Told me that he even had letters from psychologists and psychiatrists that would confirm his assessment of her deficits and problems. Sometime shortly after that, I took a call from the mother. Same story. She had all of the clearest, most articulate descriptions of her ex-husband's diagnoses and issues. She talked to him about him being a charming narcissist, and there were a whole lot of other things. She also said that she could offer me letters and proof from outside sources that would confirm her assessment of her ex-husband. And in the course of her describing to me these patterns, she was worried that I was going to be fooled like all the others have been fooled, like most of the others have been fooled. And she said to me, "You can see through him, can't you? You can see what I'm describing. His charm is not distracting you, is it? You see that he is I think she called him a narcissist or a sociopath, doesn't matter what it was." And I said to her, the same thing I want to teach you tonight. I said, I don't really think in those terms. That's just the way that he may or may not defend himself. I want to understand the hurt and scared little lost boy inside of him. The one that's feeling scared about his son's safety, the one that's feeling hurt about the things that have happened to him in his life between you and him, the one that felt hurt and unresolved with the experience he had as a child. I want to understand that person. Yes, we do diagnose. It's part of our profession. It's part of what we do, but that's not where the real work is. An adequate therapist, and that's the term I like to use. An adequate therapist is a patient therapist. The minute that I find myself losing patience with somebody, I know that I'm losing contact with them. Because if I was connected to them, if I could see them, everything would make sense. That's what I said to that supervisor that or excuse me, to that therapist that I was supervising with this child with all the attachment wounds. I said, our job is to find the story where everything that the child or the young adult or the person is doing in such a way that it makes sense. I don't care if it's what people call self-sabotage. I don't care if it's addiction. I don't care if it's regression, going back to old stages that we seem to have gotten past a long time. I don't care what the behavior is. The job of the therapist is to find the context where all of that makes perfect sense. I read something this week that said that there's no such thing as illogical behavior. We just have to find the context. We have to find the level of consciousness where it all makes sense. And that's what therapists are that's their charge, to find the story that breeds compassion. And then if we can help the client to tell the story to the people that they love and the people around them, and in telling that story, it will become clear what they need. We will do that. And if they can't do it, we will help them to do it. In this case, we would help this young man, this young adult, explain to his grandparents, explain to his home therapist what was going on and why. And I love that quote I shared recently that I saw that said, "I'm not here to change you. I'm not here to heal you. I'm here to love you. And love will be your teacher. Love will be your healing." This is why I love psychotherapy so much, is because when I get tripped up, when I get confused, when I get impatient, I know there's work for me to do. It's either diagnostic because something's coming out of the client that I'm catching, or something's coming from my background that's coming into play. But the goal is love. This is where we start to get to really important traits of the therapist. A therapist is humble. They apologize. It's it's critical that you have the experience of a therapist who's mature enough to apologize, who's done enough work that they can be wrong. That if there's a misunderstanding, if there's hurt feelings on your part, on the part of the client, and you have the phenomenal courage to share that, it's critical that the therapist see at that moment, this is where we make the gold. This is where we take the opportunity to be different. And luckily, I learned that from my therapist. I remember summoning the courage for the first time to tell her I was mad at something she had said the week before. And I fully expected her to justify, rationalize, explain how that's not what she meant, tell me how I was the problem, how I was misinterpreting, how I had a negative lens. I was waiting for all of that stuff. Does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound like your background? Does that sound like you as a parent? And my answer to both of those questions for myself is yes. It sounds like my background. It sounds like the way that I respond to my children sometimes, my wife sometimes. But she did something absolutely remarkable. She said, "You're right. I'm sorry. I did do that." But then she went on to say something else. She said, "It must have taken great courage for you to confront me like that." And I want to tell you, she explained, I feel honored that you would trust me. And that that was the moment that I knew I was with somebody different. I remember one of my professors used to say, I don't trust my clients are telling me the truth until they disagree with me. I kind of understood that, but I didn't see the power. I didn't see the opportunity until I felt it toward my therapist, till I told them what I felt about something they did, and they were able to apologize and honor the courage that it took. The therapist, the adequate therapist is always learning. Excuse me, they're meeting you where you're at. I've talked about this before. There's this phrase in our field that I hear therapists use sometimes. The phrase is trust the process. And I hate that phrase. If trust the process means follow your heart, I'm on board. But usually that phrase is used to shut the client up. In essence, to say to the therapist, I'm tired of having to go over this again. I'm tired of your skepticism. I'm tired of your suspicion. I'm tired of your doubt. I'm tired of your resistance. Of course, those aren't the words that's said. It's this beautiful little colloquialism that's just trust the process. But that's what the client feels. And at Evoke, our philosophy is we'll meet you where you're at. Come with your skepticism. If you're skeptical of this process, I assume you have a good reason. If you're suspicious of therapy or of me, I assume there's something in your background that makes that makes that to be perfect sense. Most parents, when their children say to them, I don't trust you, the first thing they try to do is get the child to trust them. Or you don't listen to me. The first thing the parent tries to do is demonstrate that they have been listening, right? You know that. This is not unique. I've been working with thousands and thousands of clients over the years, and it's practically universal. Instead, saying, you don't trust me, tell me more about that. Thank you for telling me. That must have been scary. That must have been hard. I bet you expected me to defend myself. I have done that in the past. So I appreciate you telling me. They're always still learning. You know, they're still growing. They're still working on themselves. I'm inspired by my own therapist. She's in her 80s. And she shares with me on a fairly continual basis what she learned this week in a class that she's taking. This is a woman that is smarter than anyone I've ever been around. And she's still taking classes. She's still excited about learning. And not only is she providing me that kind of model for keeping learning, but implied in her studying is the idea that she doesn't have it all figured out. And then I think to myself, maybe I don't have to have it all figured out. Maybe I can just be me. Maybe I can just be Brad. Maybe I can just be imperfect. Self-disclosure, I do more than average for sure. When people ask me about self-disclosure, my point is couple, some, even if it's general, I think is important. The client has to have some sense that you have some sense of what they've gone through. You might not tell the details of the story as a therapist, but they have to have some sense to feel safe. I have found the best results from sharing stories with people about my own fallibility, my own horrible, rotten self, my own struggle, my own insecurity, my own nervous system dysregulation. More often than not, because I do that, I get people telling me, well, you've been doing this a long time and you have a lot of experience. You have a doctoral degree and you seem really smart and you're still struggling. And my response is, yes, of course. But they don't always get that. They don't always get that. I also tell people when I'm training them, you have to be in therapy if you're going to do that. You have to make sure that you're not processing it with your client, that you're processing it somewhere else for you. So when I bring these stories to you, I'm not processing them. I do that somewhere else. I'm sharing with you after the fact the process that I've already had around it. The therapist is sensitive to your preferences, your ideas, your agendas, your requests, and they're not simply marginalized as your issue. One of my favorite stories of all time is when a colleague of mine had a new client that said, I only want to text in session. I'll sit in the same room, but I only want to text. And my wise colleague said to the client, okay. And for 6 or 7 sessions, they only texted back and forth. And then somewhere around session 7 or 8, the client started talking. That client knew then that his therapist was safe, that it wasn't going to be his therapist's agenda, his therapist's idea about what should be happening in psychotherapy. My therapist tells the story about this young man, married, comes to therapy, says to the therapist, my mother thinks I need to be here. My wife thinks I need to be here. And the therapist says, what do you think? And he says, I just want to be a director. I want to make movies. And the therapist said, let's talk about that then. Let's meet you where you're at. The pace of therapy is slow. And the first thing that needs to be established is trust. When I've taught my therapists, I say, I hear a lot of therapists talk about whether or not they trust their client. And I think that's not the most important part of the discussion. It's important. But the most important part of the discussion is, do they trust you? And it takes a while for them to experiment with you and to discover that you're not like their background. I don't think there's much of a difference between a PhD and a master's degree, frankly. If all of these other, I've seen incredibly gifted therapists with a master's degree, and I've seen incredibly inadequate therapists with a PhD. I'm more interested in, are they learning? Are they open? Are they humble? Have they done some work on the ego? Do they feel, can I feel connected to them in session? Social work psychologist, psychiatrist, again, psychiatrists oftentimes have the least amount of training. Most of their training is medical, unless they go and get it just for themselves. But I don't really have opinions about all that stuff. I just want somebody who's reading, who's studying, who's learning, who knows what they don't know, who embraces what they don't know, who doesn't have all the answers, and definitely doesn't have any idea about what I should do as their client. You deserve to ask tough questions to your therapist. And you deserve smart, intelligent answers from your therapist. I don't trust therapists who don't go to therapy or who haven't been in a lot of it if they're taking a break. I just don't. I used to teach my therapist this, and I remember one of my therapists would say to me, "But Brad, just tell me what the therapist would say." He said, "I'm a therapist. You're a therapist. Just what would they say?" And I explained to him, it's not about what they say. It's about what you're going to have to say. It's about walking into the therapist's office and sitting on that couch. It's the same reason that so many of our parents resisted. I don't know what to say. Well, if you have a good therapist, it doesn't matter. Can't fail. So I really think it's important that everybody have the experience of sitting on the other couch, both for the therapist that I'm teaching and training, for the therapist that you might be hiring. Do they get supervision? I use my therapist for supervision every week practically. I need to think it through. I need somebody to bounce ideas off of. I need somebody to maybe offer me what I might be missing. I need to know what I don't know. Does it feel like they have a certain agenda? Does it feel like they have a certain model? Does it feel like everything has to fit within certain language? If it feels like that in therapy, then the technique starts to eclipse the client. It starts to be something in between the therapist and client where there is very little contact. I place almost no emphasis on male or female. If somebody has that preference, that's fine. When I'm recommending out, I don't think about that unless somebody specifically requests it. But with all else being equal, I don't think much about it. I do place a lot of emphasis on age sometimes with people that are my age, people that are parents. With young people, I think sometimes young therapists can meet them where they're at really effectively, really naturally. They're closer culturally to them, and they can really inspire the young people. But once you get to be in the late 30s, 40s, 50s, I think it's important to have somebody that's had plenty of failures. I mean, that's the thing I value the most. I talk about this with my therapists, my family who are therapists all the time. Unless you've had big failures, it's hard to be aware. You have to experience some disasters to know yourself. That could look like an addiction and recovery. That could look like a divorce. That could look like any number of crises that you've experienced. I had a friend who was starting to date a woman who was in recovery for drugs and alcohol, and he said to me that he was worried that there was a great risk here. And I said to him, of course, there's always a risk. There's always a risk. And he said, I don't want to admit this, but I'm afraid he told me that people might judge me for dating this woman that I met who's had a pretty significant addiction history. Now is in recovery for several years. And my spot is in some ways, those are the people that I trust the most. They've had to find a mirror. They've had to look inside. They have less judgment, which is a huge value of mine for as a partner or a friend or somebody I'm going to spend time with. They have less judgment. Individual and family therapy, this is something I've been teaching over the last couple of years. I think individual therapy is easier as a therapist. It's easier as a client. And know this. If you're going to couples therapy or family therapy, let's say that there's 3 of you in family therapy. At best, 1/3 of the session is going to feel good to you. Going to feel like it's there to support you, that you're being supported. And if you're a parent, I would say it's far less than even 1/3 of the time. Because the therapist has to make sure everybody's feeling safe, and sometimes somebody needs to say something that somebody else is not ready to hear, and then you are up against it, right? You have to figure out who to support. So I think family therapy and couples therapy is more advanced. I really do. I'll also say that I haven't been to couples therapy or family therapy in a long time. I've been to I've been to many, many sessions in my life to family therapy for my own family and couples therapy with my wife. But at this point, all the issues that are of my concern are mine. I'm the problem. Good news, I'm also the solution. But I'm who I trip over. I'm who I get stuck with. I'm the one who needs to understand, become more self aware to become capable of pressing forward in my life. Most therapists will not see two members of the same family. I don't follow that policy. I'm not taking any new clients and won't be for a long time. But I don't follow that policy because I learned and watched my therapist do it. The only risk I see is when family members or individuals in a couple use the therapist, they weaponize the therapist against each other. That's the point when I might excuse myself from that kind of a dynamic because then that makes it difficult. But otherwise, I prefer it. Otherwise, I prefer to see multiple members of the same family if they are going to be seen in therapy. Like I said, they're flexible even with this, and they work with you for your goals. They're just as interested, more interested in your goals than what their theory, what their model tells them they should be looking for. This is from an article I wrote for a journal. Therapy has become problem solving rather than a process of discovery of the self. The discovery of the self is not fostered by offering advice or answers, but rather by asking better questions. Gill refers to this advice giving form of therapy as abuse. She wrote, the therapist or guide we choose must not duplicate the wounds of the past. Thus, if the therapist or guide knows what is right for us and manipulates us to achieve these treatment goals, it is abuse, plain and simple. And it is hard to see how good abuse ever cures bad abuse. Are you hearing the themes yet? It's a different sensibility. It's a different place. It's about as different as Salt Lake City is from Cinque Terre in Italy, right? It's a different sensibility. I was just watching a movie the other night, a Japanese movie, really interesting movie. And what my family and I were taking with was how different it was culturally. The family relationships, even the the way that the different characters would engage them each other socially was very, very different. That's how different psychotherapy. In fact, it even feels more alien than that for many of us. The experience, one of my favorite quotes that Jamie ever wrote, she said, the experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, what was very bad at home is now nothing. This difference in experience allows for the realization things could be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. The goal is finding you rather than fixing you. Even when I've trained therapists at our intensive program, we use psychodrama, role playing, empty chair, things like that. The most common mistake that I see that young therapists make is they try to bring the client to some magnificent end, some aha or epiphany moment. I call it pulling a rabbit out of a hat, using that analogy. But really, we're just being a witness. And we evoke from the individual client their experience, their past, their feelings, their dilemma. We draw it out by being a safe person, by being non-judgmental, by not being eager to fix. Because our eagerness to fix is just a euphemism for anxiety. And that anxiety gets interpreted by the client as pressure. It reminds them of home. It reminds them of their parents. We try to find the client, find their story, look for somebody who's looking for you. And the healing comes because of this unique experience like Gil just explained. Part of the business, she goes on to say, of psychotherapy is to discover and create alternate experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves. Listen to that. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different space is that it quickly illuminates one's own. What was automatic and unconscious is noticed and discussed. The world is allowed to become one of noticeable constructions. The fish is often the last one to discover water. The fish has to know not water to know what water is. There's a funny story given at a commencement speech some years ago by a poet. He tells the story of an old fish swimming along and comes across two younger fish. And the old fish says to the two young fish, as he swims by, he says, "How's the water today, boys?" And the two young fish look at each other after he swims by and says, "What the hell is water?" That's the idea of the Jamie's teaching. You have to experience something so different that it begins to illuminate. You start to see things you couldn't see because you're experiencing something different. Very little advice, very few directives. It's very hard to pull out advice or a directive from me in therapy. I do my best not to. We can brainstorm ideas of something or some things that could work aimed at the goal that you've set for yourself, but I'm not giving assignments. I don't like giving assignments in therapy unless somebody asks, and even then I'm reluctant because I don't want them to feel the pressure if they don't do them. So that if they come back and they haven't, I don't want them canceling because they haven't completed their assignments. I also don't want it to initiate inside of me to them because I don't want them. The goal isn't for them to live my life. My therapist said for many years, when I must have been asking for advice, she would say, "Don't ask me. My life's a mess." And I wasn't understanding what she was saying, but now I understand. I'm bumbling through this thing too. We're all just walking each other home. I used to say to her, "Why don't you call me on my stuff? I can take it," I would tell her. And she would always say, "I'm just trying to understand." And I didn't understand what that meant. Again, I thought she was punting. I thought she was avoiding. And now I understand. She was going as fast as she could. She really was. She was going as fast as I would allow her to go. And I felt no pressure to go any faster. They are empathic and understanding primarily. If they become frustrated, angry, impatient, anxious, eager, annoyed, disapproving, blaming, shaming, labeling, focused on their model and agenda to the exclusion of yours, you might consider getting a new therapist. I always tell people when they ask me they don't know if they have a right therapist, I always say that the magic potion is tell your therapist you're upset. And if they respond with gratitude, with the sense of honoring the difficulty that it was, then you know you got a good one. If they get defensive and turn it around on you, talk about how you're misunderstanding the purpose or how you're getting it wrong or something in your background is causing you to be upset, then you know who you have somebody that hasn't done the work. Further along in this article that I wrote for the journal, I wrote, one could call the practice of applying terms, techniques, and theory without the recognition of the therapeutic process doing psychology. It may be evident in statements like, you are in denial, you are rationalizing. In their frustration and with an overwhelming sense of impotence at their ability to make behavioral change, therapists may claim his mother has borderline personality disorder, and her unwillingness to receive feedback is evidence of her resistance. These labels and assumptions often bespeak the clinical staff's frustration and may ultimately serve to ensure that the therapist does not encounter their own self, which may lie buried deep in the unconscious in order to preserve a sense of likability. While labels can be a shorthand for therapists to identify patterns of defenses, like I mentioned earlier, in clients, they are often used to excuse the therapist from the equation. Alice Miller suggested that the idea that therapists may cloak their disapproval and derision behind abstract terms like borderline, obsessive, regressive, destructive, but unless they are willing to explore the 3-year-old boy or girl inside of themselves, they may not see the parallel between these terms and garden variety contempt. You want a therapist who's worked. You want a therapist who's working. What is an adequate container, you might ask? It's authentic, it's rational, it's honest, it's not fear-based. You're able to tolerate the other person. You're able to provide safety, a regulated nervous system. If you do have reactions, you own them as your own. Take responsibility and work on them. And if you're having strong reactions, you seek consultation. I taught therapists when you become frustrated or disappointed with a client, or other people for that matter, you have lost contact with the other. If you could really see them and connect to them, then you would not be frustrated because you'd understand them. Attachment theory tells us that a person's sense of well-being is the result of having a parent who provided an adequate container. An adequate container is the mind of the parent, where the child experiences himself as welcomed and safe. If the parent was able to hold the child in her mind, that is, tolerate the child, then the child's experience is that they are okay. When the parent's limitations are expressed in disappointment, disgust, or anger, the child is likely to interpret this message as, I am not okay, in order to manage this feeling of dread that comes when the parent is upset. I will learn to put away those things that are upsetting. In The Journey of the Heroic Parent, I wrote, if they have no sense of their wounds or their limitations, they won't be able to provide an adequate container for the client to discover their own context. An effective container is a place where one feels safe to explore all the parts of themselves, free from judgments. In this way, the container is the mind of the therapist. Therapy is not a place that we go to listen to difficult things, but rather a place that we go in order to share difficult things. One of the authors of the paper that I was writing heard a therapist say to a client, if you came into a session and told me you were in love with a chicken, that was me, I would assume that you'd have a good reason and I would be curious. It is this kind of container that allows us to re-experience ourselves and to rid ourselves of shame. And after shame subsides, we can see the wound with compassion and begin to heal. I have two more quotes for you before we wrap up. Jamie Gill wrote this in one of her books. It's important to recognize that the defense is doing important work, psychological work, or the energy required to maintain it would not make sense. Ripping away defenses does not improve the situation. Taking them away before the person is able to tolerate what the defenses mask leaves the person worse off than before. At least before he or she could function. And then my favorite quote from this passage. Both cruel people and inadequate therapists are famous for a desire to destroy defenses without considering the consequences. I think of therapy as a sacred confessional. It is an altar. It is an altar where we lay down our armor. The greatest act of courage is when the client is able to share their anger, disappointment, and hurt towards the therapist. It is at this moment that the wound either reappears or something else manifests in its place. If the therapist's ego is in play, the wound will feel familiar and old. If the therapist has overcome their ego needs sufficiently, the client has an altogether different experience and a new world is possible. In the end, just taking you home, you get to decide, and it's not your job to train your therapist. Look for a therapist who looks to understand you and is not eager and anxious to fix you. You can ask tough questions. You have the right to ask tough questions, and you deserve intelligent, honest answers. Do you feel like you're an object that they're trying to fix, or you're your own person? How you feel matters in therapy. It matters more than anything. And it ought not to be treated merely as your issue. If you get upset with them, they don't make it about you or your issues. It's okay to disagree with your therapist. It's really okay. It's okay for you to share with them how you feel about them. And ideally, they can laugh at themselves. And in the end, an adequate therapist doesn't need to be good and doesn't need you to think that they are good. So I hope this information equips you with what to look for in a therapist. All right, folks. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, which talk about all these things, is available on Amazon and Audible. Like I mentioned, if you want to do a deep dive with people that are absolutely skillfully trained in this model, Finding You is that option. March 20th through 24th is our next available in person, then April 12th online. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com. We also have custom programs for families and couples. We have support groups for our current and alumni wilderness parents. March 7th at 7 p.m. is that next offering. Once a month, we have an alumni only meeting for people that are farther along. March 18th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is that offering. And then, of course, our intensives and coaching clients and alumni. March 11th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is your offering. Contact support groups at evoketherapy.com for more information. I believe your best chance of getting some of what I'm talking about can be found in many of the people that provide our coaching services. So if you're looking for somebody who's been introduced to and trained in this model, go to our website or contact coaching at evoketherapy.com to find out more. We ask all current families and anybody who's listening to just try any combination, 6 of any combination of the following support groups: Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to RefugeRecovery.org for a Buddhist-inspired recovery program with less of an emphasis on a higher power. And the National Alliance on Mental Illness has free classes and resources in your local community. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast, or go to SoundCloud.com on your computer and search Finding You there. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the rebroadcast of the video versions of these. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on X, Threads, and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. And you can find Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content each week. All right, folks, this is going to be my only live broadcast of this week. I'm going to be back a week from today, March 12th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going to be taking any of your questions left over from today. You can always email us in between at webinar@evoketherapy.com. If you want copies of the slides from tonight or any of our broadcasts, you can also request those by emailing us at webinar@evoketherapy.com. I hope this was a helpful point of contact. I hope this equips you with some information about what to look for. And as always, for and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thank you for showing up to these and being willing to do your work. It makes all the difference in the world. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.